March 3rd, 1943, 10:15 hours. Bismarck Sea, 30 nautical miles northwest of Lae, New Guinea. The oil-blackened hand trembled as a Japanese naval officer gripped the splintered remains of what had once been part of the destroyer Arashio's bridge structure, his uniform soaked with fuel oil and seawater, recording in his mind words that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. Through salt-burned eyes, he watched American B-25 Mitchell bombers circle back over the debris field that stretched for miles across the Bismarck Sea. Oil slicks, burning wreckage, and thousands of men desperately clinging to anything that would float. The convoy that had departed Rabaul with such confidence just 2 days earlier was now nothing more than flotsam, and the survivors were about to discover that their ordeal was far from over. 6,900 soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army's 51st Division had boarded 8 transport ships at Simpson Harbour, Rabaul on February 28th, convinced they would reinforce Lae and turn the tide in New Guinea. What they encountered instead would shatter every conception of warfare they had been taught, every notion of honour between enemies, and every assumption about American military conduct that Japanese propaganda had instilled in them. The planning had begun in late December 1942 at Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura, commanding the 8th Area Army at Rabaul, faced an increasingly desperate situation in New Guinea. The Japanese convoy was a result of a Japanese Imperial General Headquarters decision in December 1942 to reinforce their position in the Southwest Pacific. The convoy would consist of 8 destroyers escorting 8 transport ships carrying the main body of the 51st Division, elite troops transferred from China. On 28 February 1943, the convoy, comprising 8 destroyers and 8 troop transports with an escort of approximately 100 fighter aircraft, set out from Simpson Harbour in Rabaul. The convoy commander, Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, flew his flag from the destroyer Shirayuki. A veteran of numerous successful convoy operations, Kimura understood the risks. The 18th Army staff held war games that predicted losses of 4 out of 10 transports and between 30 and 40 aircraft. They gave the operation only a 50-50 chance of success. March 1st, 1943. As the convoy rounded the northern coast of New Britain, the first American reconnaissance aircraft appeared, a B-24 Liberator from the 91st Bombardment Group. What the Japanese didn't know was that their every move had been anticipated. The Allies had detected preparations for the convoy, and naval codebreakers in Melbourne, FRUMEL, and Washington, D.C., had decrypted and translated messages indicating the convoy's intended destination and date of arrival. At 5th Air Force Headquarters, General George Kenney received the news he had been waiting for. For months, his air crews had been perfecting a revolutionary technique. Skip bombing was a low-level bombing technique independently developed by several of the combatant nations in World War II, notably Italy, Australia, Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States. It allows an aircraft to attack shipping by skipping the bomb across the water like a stone. Major Paul Pappy Gunn had modified B-25 Mitchell bombers, installing up to 8 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns in the nose. Combined with skip bombing techniques, these flying gunships could devastate shipping at close range. Dawn broke grey and overcast on March 2nd. At 1000 hours, the clouds parted. 29 B-17 flying fortresses appeared at high altitude. When a force of 29 B-17s hit the convoy, a large merchant vessel was sunk, 2 others damaged, and a destroyer was set on fire. The first victim was the Kyokusei Maru, carrying 1,500 troops and drums of aviation fuel. B-17 pilots reported seeing the transport Kyokusei Maru breaking in half and sinking. The 5,493-ton transport exploded in a fireball visible from every ship in the convoy. The destroyers Asagumo and Yukikaze immediately moved in to rescue survivors, pulling oil-soaked men from the water. This act of humanity would soon prove tactically dangerous as they had to reduce speed. The morning of March 3rd dawned clear, perfect flying weather. The convoy, now reduced to 7 transports and 8 destroyers, had covered nearly 2/3 of the distance to Leh. At 1000 hours, death arrived from multiple directions. All of the Japanese plans fell apart, however, at 10 a.m. on March 3rd, 1943, in the Bismarck Sea just off the New Guinea coast from Leh. In the span of about 15 minutes, the Japanese lost World War II. First came B-17 at high altitude, drawing Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft guns skyward. Then, while everyone was looking up, 13 Australian Beaufighters swept in at mast height, their 8 forward-firing guns raking the decks. Behind them came the modified B-25s, approaching so low their prop wash left wakes on the water. The skip bombing technique proved devastatingly effective. The bombs would skip over the surface of the water in a manner similar to stone skipping and either bounce into the side of the ship and detonate, or submerge and explode next to the ship. Captain Ed Larner, leading the 90th Squadron's modified B-25s, approached the transport Teiyo Maru at wave height. His forward guns silenced the ship's anti-aircraft positions. The bombs released from Larner's B-25 skipped twice across the water before slamming into the Teiyo Maru's hull at the waterline. The 6,870-ton transport broke in half and sank within minutes. By 10:15, 15 minutes after the initial attack, all 7 transports had been hit and some were sinking. 3 of their destroyer escorts had also been badly damaged or had already sunk. The destroyer Shirayuki, Admiral Kimura's flagship, took a direct hit that detonated her forward magazine. She disappeared in a massive explosion. By noon on March 3rd, the Bismarck Sea had become a hellscape. Oil fires burned across the surface. The water, thick with bunker fuel, was littered with debris and thousands of men, soldiers who couldn't swim, exhausted sailors, wounded clinging to wreckage. Conservative estimates placed over 3,000 men in the water. The 4 surviving destroyers, Yukikaze, Asagumo, Uranami and Shikinami, began rescue operations. Some 2,700 survivors were taken to Rabaul by the destroyers, but they could only do so much before Allied aircraft returned. At 1400 hours on March 3rd, the American planes returned with a different purpose. The survivors watched with initial relief as aircraft approached. Surely they were photographing the destruction. That relief turned to horror as the planes descended to wave height and opened fire. In a controversial move, Allies patrolled the waters for several days, strafing survivors in lifeboats. This was later justified as necessary to prevent the enemy from coming ashore. B-25s, A-20 Havocs, and Beaufighters made repeated passes, their machine guns churning the water into foam. The tactical justification was clear from the American perspective. These were enemy soldiers who, if they reached shore, would reinforce the Japanese garrison at Leh. As for the strafing of Japanese survivors in the water, they did it keep them from reaching shore and becoming part of the Japanese forces. General Kenney's orders were explicit. No Japanese soldier was to reach New Guinea alive. For the Japanese in the water, this violated every concept of honourable warfare. The Bushido Code spoke of treating defeated enemies with dignity. What they experienced shattered these assumptions completely. As darkness fell on March 3rd, American PT boats entered the area. That night, a force of 10 U.S. Navy PT boats, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Barry Atkins, set out to attack the convoy. The PT boats systematically hunted survivors through the night. Their searchlights swept across the water, followed by machine gun fire. PT-143 and PT-150 found the damaged transport Oigawa Maru still afloat and torpedoed it, sending more men into the water. For the Japanese survivors, the night brought additional horrors. Sharks, drawn by blood and distressed movements, began attacking. Men who had survived the sinking and strafing now faced death from below. Dawn on March 4th revealed the full scope of the disaster. the debris field stretched for 40 miles. Small groups of survivors still dotted the sea, many having spent over 20 hours in the water. The American aircraft returned with the sunrise. On March 4th, the Allies sent torpedo boats and aircraft to patrol the area. They strafed Japanese survivors and rescue vessels. B-25s, A-20s, Beaufighters, and P-38 Lightning fighters systematically attacked anything that moved. The destroyer Asashio, which had remained behind to rescue survivors, became a particular target. In the morning, a fourth destroyer, Asashio, was sunk when a B-17 hit her with a 500-pound, 230-kilogram bomb while she was picking up survivors from Arashio. She sank quickly, taking rescued soldiers with her. The American justification for the strafing came from both tactical necessity and revenge. As recorded by James Duffy in his book War at the End of the World, a B-17, the Double Trouble, piloted by Lieutenant Woodrow W. Moore, collided with a Zero. As 7 members of the bomber crew parachuted down several Zeros, gunned them down as they floated helplessly down. This was observed by crews of other American bombers. This incident had enraged American pilots. General Kenney later called these attacks mopping up operations. For the next several days, American and Australian airmen returned to the site of the battle, systematically prowling the seas in search of Japanese survivors. As a coup de grace, Kenney ordered his aircrew to strafe Japanese lifeboats and rafts. He euphemistically called these missions mopping up operations. A secret March 20th, 1943 report stated, "The slaughter continued till nightfall. If any survivors were permitted to slip by our strafing aircraft, they were a minimum of 30 miles from land, in water thickly infested by man-eating sharks." Japanese submarines I-17 and I-26 attempted rescue operations, moving carefully to avoid American aircraft. On the 6th of March, the Japanese submarines I-17 and I-26 picked up 170 survivors. 2 days later, I-26 found another 54 and put them ashore at Leh. These submarines could only take limited numbers, leaving hundreds behind. The submarine crews described horrific scenes, men calling out in darkness, oil-covered survivors too weak to climb aboard, the necessity of choosing who to save. The statistics were staggering. Of 6,900 troops who were badly needed in New Guinea, only about 1,200 made it to Leh. Another 2,700 were rescued by destroyers and submarines and returned to Rabaul. Approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors had been killed. American losses were minimal. Allied losses numbered 4 aircraft and 13 airmen. This 230-to-1 casualty ratio was unprecedented in naval warfare. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea marked a turning point. As a result of the losses, the Japanese never again risked sending a large convoy into water that was controlled by American aircraft. Japan would never again attempt to reinforce garrisons by surface convoy within range of Allied aircraft. After the war, Captain Tameichi Hara, who commanded destroyer Shigura, not present at the battle, interviewed survivors and wrote the most famous Japanese assessment. Never was there such a debacle. It was the complete opposite of the successful withdrawal operation from Guadalcanal. His interviews with participants revealed the psychological devastation. Japan's defeat there was unbelievable. The battle showcased revolutionary aerial warfare techniques the Japanese hadn't anticipated. Skip bombing, combined with heavily armed strafer aircraft, had turned medium bombers into ship killers. After Pearl Harbor, December 1941, it was used prominently against Imperial Japanese Navy warships and transports by Major William Benn of the 63rd Squadron, 43rd Bomb Group, Heavy, 5th Air Force, United States Army Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific Area Theater during World War II. Major Paul Pappy Gunn's modifications had created flying battleships. Maj Paul Gunn of the 90th BS/3rd BG, who developed a strafer version of the A-20 and B-25. With 8 to 14 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns, these aircraft could devastate anti-aircraft defences before delivering bombs at point-blank range. Not all survivors died in the water. Small groups reached various islands, beginning desperate struggles for survival. One band of 18 survivors landed on Kiriwina, where they were captured by PT-114. Another made its way to Guadalcanal, only to be killed by an American patrol. On Goodenough Island, Australian patrols hunted Japanese survivors. On Goodenough Island, between 8 and 14 March 1943, Australian patrols from the 47th Infantry Battalion found and killed 72 Japanese, captured 42 and found another 9 dead on a raft. The Japanese didn't know until after the war that their convoy had been doomed from the start. The Allies had detected preparations for the convoy, and naval codebreakers in Melbourne, FRUMEL, and Washington, D.C., had decrypted and translated messages indicating the convoy's intended destination and date of arrival. Every detail, composition, route, timing, had been known to the Allies. The Japanese, convinced their codes were unbreakable, had sailed into a carefully prepared trap. For the Japanese military, steeped in Bushido tradition, the Bismarck Sea massacre created a fundamental crisis. The code of Bushido emphasized honor in combat, respect for enemies, dignity in defeat. The methodical killing of helpless men in water violated every principle they understood. The survivors who returned to Rabaul were profoundly changed. They had witnessed American ruthlessness that contradicted all propaganda about American weakness. The image of aircraft systematically hunting men in the water would haunt Japanese forces throughout the Pacific. Many survivors reported complete loss of faith in victory. If Americans would machine gun helpless men in water, what wouldn't they do? This psychological impact influenced Japanese decisions to fight to the death rather than surrender, convinced that capture meant certain execution. The strafing of survivors remains controversial. Under international law, shipwreck survivors who are helpless should be protected. However, the law was ambiguous about enemy combatants who hadn't formally surrendered. Japanese forces had committed their own atrocities, the rape of Nanking, Bataan Death March, and machine gunning of American aircrew in parachutes. Yet the Bismarck Sea represented something different, killing for tactical efficiency rather than cruelty. American veterans defended the actions as military necessity. These weren't surrendered prisoners, but enemy soldiers heading to reinforce Leh. The proximity to shore, some only 10 to 15 miles away, meant many could potentially reach land. The Bismarck Sea disaster forced complete reassessment of Japanese strategy. Admiral Minachi Koga, who succeeded Yamamoto as commander-in-chief, recognized that surface vessels couldn't survive in waters dominated by enemy aircraft. New Guinea was effectively abandoned as indefensible. The psychological impact rippled through Japanese forces. Units scheduled for transport began experiencing unprecedented desertion rates. The prospect of being caught at sea by American aircraft became a terror surpassing combat itself. For the Americans, the battle proved that air power alone could defeat naval forces. Land-based aircraft, properly equipped and trained, could dominate sea lanes without carriers. This lesson influenced Pacific strategy for the war's remainder. After the war, the question of whether the strafing constituted a war crime was quietly debated but never prosecuted. The official American position maintained these were enemy combatants who could have reached shore and continued fighting. The absence of prosecution while Japanese officers were executed for similar acts reflected victors' justice. Both sides had crossed lines in the Pacific War's brutal conduct, but only the losers faced judgment. Historians recognize the Battle of the Bismarck Sea as a watershed moment in aerial warfare. The statistics tell the story. All 8 transports sunk, 4 destroyers destroyed, approximately 3,000 Japanese killed versus 13 Allied airmen lost. But beyond numbers, the battle represented transformation of warfare itself. Technology and intelligence had produced casualty ratios that were essentially massacres. The image of aircraft methodically strafing helpless men became emblematic of the Pacific War's merciless nature. General Douglas MacArthur called it the decisive aerial engagement of the war in the Southwest Pacific. This assessment proved accurate. Japan never recovered the strategic initiative in New Guinea. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea demonstrated that modern warfare had evolved beyond traditional concepts of combat between armed forces. Air power, combined with intelligence and technological innovation, could produce annihilation rather than victory. For Japan, it marked the beginning of the end in the Southwest Pacific. Unable to reinforce or supply garrisons within Allied air range, Japanese forces were condemned to isolation and eventual destruction. For America, it proved their transformation from Pearl Harbor's shocked victims to practitioners of ruthless efficiency. The same nation that had been stunned by surprise attack had become capable of methodically destroying thousands of enemies. The controversy over strafing survivors reflects war's moral complexity. Military necessity and humanitarian law collided in the oil-slicked waters of the Bismarck Sea. Both sides learned that in total war, traditional limits would be repeatedly crossed. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea stands as one of the most decisive and controversial engagements of World War II. In 3 days, American and Australian air power destroyed an entire Japanese convoy, killing thousands and ending any hope of reinforcing New Guinea by sea. The shocked Japanese survivors who witnessed Americans strafing helpless men in water carried psychological wounds that never healed. They had encountered an enemy capable of ruthlessness beyond their imagination, shattering assumptions about American weakness and the nature of warfare itself. The battle's legacy extends beyond its immediate strategic impact. It demonstrated air power's ability to dominate sea lanes, the value of intelligence in modern warfare, and the moral ambiguities of total war. The image of aircraft systematically killing survivors remains one of the Pacific War's most troubling episodes. In the end, approximately 3,000 Japanese died in the waters of the Bismarck Sea, not in glorious battle, but in methodical slaughter. Their shocked survivors returned to spread word of American ruthlessness that would influence Japanese military psychology for the war's remainder. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea proved that in modern warfare, technological superiority could produce annihilation. The Japanese were shocked by American willingness to kill without quarter, learning that their enemies had evolved into something more terrible than propaganda had ever suggested. That lesson, learned in blood and terror over 3 days in March 1943, would shape the Pacific War's increasingly brutal character until its atomic conclusion.